Well, all right, we are back with our series on Paul's missionary journeys. We're in the book of Acts, chapter 17. We're in the middle of the second missionary journey, and where we left off last week, Paul and Silas had been in Thessalonica. Then they went to Berea, and Paul is now going to head to Athens. We took a break during the middle of this chapter because this section here in Athens is so dense. It has a lot of just details that really need to be looked into. I wanted to give it a proper amount of detail, and also his time in Corinth. So we're in chapter 17, verse 16, and if you would, we're going to just walk through this. Take a moment to read all the way through the end of chapter 17, and then we'll get to 18 in a moment. So read 17, and we'll come back. Well, now that you've read about Paul's stay in Athens, let's go through it just bit by bit. Now, first off, to give you the history of Athens, as most of you who know some of the history of Western Civ, Athens is a pretty important city. It at this point in time, it was not as heavily populated as it had been in ancient times. 400 years before this, it was the seat of Greek power. 600 years before this, it had fought a massive war against Sparta, and even before this, it had always been in antiquity a large, influential city filled with philosophers, with a unique form of democratic representative government. At this point, the citizens who had true citizenship only numbered about 5,000. But there were tens and hundreds of thousands of people living there who were from other parts. It was still the philosophical capital of Rome. So new ideas, education, university, it was that type of city, even if it had not had the economic and political power it once had. So, as you know, Athens, a storied history of being the birthplace of democracy, of classical Western civilization. The Greek city-state at one point was so powerful it could fight an empire by heading together a league of Greek city-states. And where we find it today is when Paul comes in there. It says, verse 16, his spirit was provoked. He saw the city, or within him, as he saw that the city was full of idols. Paul is angry. He's incensed at the idolatry. All the buildings and all the temples had statues and idols, and while some of the philosophers might have been able to kind of coyly wink at each other and say, hey, we know these are just statues, your common Athenian would worship and adorn these with offerings. So he reasoned in the synagogue with the Jews and the devout persons, and in the marketplace every day with those who happened to be there. So he follows his same tendency to go into the synagogue first, and he will talk to the Jews and Greek God-fearers about the gospel. But because Athens had this philosophical university town mindset, Paul could go during the week and talk with philosophers in the marketplace. So some of the Epicurean and Stoic philosophers also conversed with him, and some said, what does this babbler wish to say? Others said, he seems to be a preacher of foreign divinities because he was preaching Jesus and the resurrection. The word for resurrection is anastasis, and so they might have thought he was talking about a god named Jesus and a goddess named Anastasia. So they don't quite know what he's doing. When they call him a babbler, the word's kind of funny. It means someone who pieces together various beliefs and thoughts from different schools and just kind of mashes them together on their own. So it's kind of like talking about somebody who might go to the library and read a few books and think that they're a physicist who can solve the world's energy problems. But the Epicureans are interesting because we'll talk for a minute about who they were. Epicureans believed that pleasure was the main point of life. They didn't necessarily believe in gods and goddesses. I don't think they were necessarily atheistic. They just thought if there are gods, they don't care about us. What does it matter to them? They thought that the main goal was to get pleasure. Now, they weren't hedonists. A hedonist is someone who gets maximum pleasure at the cost sometimes of having some pain. So you think about someone who goes out all night drinking and they wake up in the morning with a humongous hangover. That's a hedonist. An Epicurean was someone who might use some wisdom and say, if you overdo that, you're going to wake up the next day regretting it. So you should try to think of pleasure today, pleasure tomorrow. How do you maximize all the enjoyment, not just get a fit of enjoyment that you recover for longer than the enjoyment lasted? So the Epicureans used wisdom, but it was still about pleasure and finding, just that as the point of life. They weren't necessarily religious, like I said. They said if the gods do care about us, then we wouldn't know, and it doesn't matter. They're probably indifferent to us. The Stoics were different. Stoics, that was the favorite Roman philosophy, because the Romans were so stubborn, and the Romans were really big on just doing your duty, even if you suffered for it. Stoicism was appealing to them. Now, Stoicism wasn't necessarily religious. It said that God was everywhere and in everything. It was panentheism. But Stoicism taught that if you disengage yourself from pleasure, disengage yourself from pain, you only do your duty, do the honorable thing. That was what humanity was about. That was what being a man was about. That was how you kept your soul free. You could enjoy pleasure if you held it with an open hand, and you could even, grumble at pain at the other side and say, this is not good, but you had to take one and the other. Had to take them both indifferently. Just set your face, do your duty like a good Roman. So the Stoics and Epicureans didn't like Paul. They thought he was an uneducated cobbler together of ideas. It says that in verse 19, they took him and brought him to the Areopagus, or Mars Hill, in some translations, saying, may we know what this new teaching is that you're presenting. It sounds like a trial. And there's some history that says that if Greeks in this city heard something new, they wanted to get it examined, they would take it to a type of trial where the person would have to defend their viewpoints to make sure it was, first, a legitimate Roman religion, and number two, not degrading the social order. Now this is what's funny in verse 21. Now all the Athenians and the foreigners who lived there would spend their time in nothing except telling or hearing something new. This shows Luke's knowledge of the area firsthand. A large foreign population in Athens, like I said, it was a university town, and they loved their philosophy. So Paul, standing in the midst of the Areopagus, said, men of Athens, I perceive that in every way you are very religious. Now, the word for religious here is not necessarily the word we would use for a pious, humble, dedicated religious person. It's the word also used for superstition. Remember in verse 16, Paul was angry when he saw all the idols. So we think that Paul's telling the Athenians, you're very superstitious. You got gods everywhere. They're on every single one of your buildings. Some of them have, several gods fighting. And he says in verse 23, for as I passed along and observed the objects of your worship, I found also an altar with this inscription, to the unknown God. What therefore you worship as unknown, this I proclaim to you. And he starts a sermon a lot different than some of his Jewish sermons he does in the book of Acts. Now, what is this idea here of the unknown God? Some people say that in ancient times, Athens had a plague, and it was just ravaging the city. So they sacrificed to their god, and nothing happened. And they sacrificed to another god, and nothing else happened. They sacrificed, no god would listen to them. And finally, a wise man said, well, there must be a God you don't know. And that's why the plague won't end. So, as the plague continued, the Athenians made an altar and they sacrificed something to this unknown god, and the plague stopped. And because they never knew which god it was, they kept the altar open just in case they would need it again. So Paul uses this story, if this is true, like this story where scholars still talk about it. If this story is true, Paul uses this common idea in their mind and says, well, this was who you sacrificed to, not knowing it, and I'm going to proclaim him to you. And if that story is not true, it still serves the same point. There was a God. They said, just in case we've missed one, here he is. And Paul uses that to proclaim to them. Now, we talk about this sermon has a lot of natural revelation in it versus specific or special revelation. It talks about something all humans know, that there's a God who made the heaven and the earth. And Paul talks about stuff that all cultures would agree on. But then he talks in verse 30, the times of ignorance God overlooked, but now he commands all people everywhere to repent, because he has fixed a day on which he will judge the world in righteousness by a man whom he has appointed. And of this he has given assurance to all by raising him from the dead. Now when they heard from the resurrection of the dead, some mocked, but others said, we will hear you again about this. It's funny because neither the Epicureans nor the Stoics believed in the resurrection. The Greeks themselves thought the resurrection of the body was the most foolish idea they had heard, because the body was a vulgar, terrible thing. The spirit and the soul was good. And so the resurrection of the body made them say, oh, what a childish religion this must be. But some people did believe. If you look in verse 34, some men joined him and believed, among whom also were Dionysius the Areopagite, so a guy who was in charge of Mars Hill, and a woman named Damaris, and others with them. So some people believed from Paul's sermon. It was not a swing and a miss. And he ends up using this to launch the church in Athens. Now, just to give you one brief point here, and I told you about this last week, is that Paul also uses this time to preach this unique sermon, but also to write an epistle, a letter. And if you turn with me to the book of 1 Thessalonians, you're going to find something out. In 1 Thessalonians, Paul has been separated from that church very quickly after its inception, its birth. And he says in chapter 1, and we're looking at verse 7. He says here, you became an example to all the believers in Macedonia and in Achaia, for not only has the word of the Lord sounded forth from you in Macedonia and from Achaia, but your faith in God has gone forth everywhere, so that we need not say anything. So remember the vision of the man in Macedonia saying, come preach here, and Paul did, and the Thessalonians, even though he was only there a short amount of time, their faith was so real, the rest of the region was hearing about how well they followed the Lord. They were being a fully functional Christian church, even early on in their life. So look in chapter 2, verse 9. You remember, brothers, our labor and toil. We work night and day that we might not be a burden to any of you while we proclaim to you the gospel of God. You are witnesses, and God also, of how holy and righteous and blameless was our conduct toward you believers. So Paul points back to the situation in Acts that we read about briefly, and talks about how they worked in front of them, giving them an example. And just amazing that how quickly they were. But here's chapter 3, verse 1. Go chapter 3, verse 1. Therefore, when we could bear it no longer, we were willing to be left behind at Athens alone, and we sent Timothy, our brother, and God's co-worker in the gospel of Christ, to establish and exhort you in your faith. So Timothy had gone from them while they were at Athens, when Paul was preaching at Mars Hill and working in that city. Timothy, remember we talked about Timothy just last week. He had not been in ministry very long, and Paul sends him because his heart for them was so heavy, and he helps the Thessalonians. And after he comes back, Paul writes this letter to them, encouraging them further. So it's interesting that the first or the earliest letter we think that Paul wrote was to this church in when Paul was in Athens. He writes to Thessalonica. So now let's talk about Corinth. After this, chapter 18, verse 1. After this, Paul left Athens and went to Corinth. And you can pause now, read chapter 18, verses 1 through 17. Don't read all the way through. And we'll come back and discuss Paul in Corinth. Well, if you've read this, you see that Corinth is a bit different. Now, let me give you the history of Corinth. Corinth was also a powerful city in Greece. It was the shipbuilding city. They made triremes there, this fighting ship with 2 or 3 rows trireme of oars, and they would ram each other a lot, and fighting men would jump off, and there's the legend of Greek fire. They would spit out this sappy substance that would burn and catch other ships on fire. Well, Corinth was the place where a lot of these ships were made, and it was a very powerful city. At this time, it was bigger, vaster, and had more economic power than Athens. Even though Athens was the philosophical hub, Corinth was really the power in Greece as a city. It had been destroyed by the Romans, but then later on they just rebuilt it because it was on such a good location, and by this time was a bustling metropolis, a huge city. And if you look at what Paul does there, he goes to the synagogue like usual. But something happens. Now look, when Silas and Timothy arrived, this is verse 5, when Silas and Timothy arrived from Macedonia, and that's, we guess, when they came back from visiting the Thessalonica church, Thessalonian church. Paul and Timothy arrived there. Paul was occupied with the word, testifying to the Jews that the Christ was Jesus. And when they opposed and reviled him, he shook out his garments and said to them, "Your blood be on your own heads. I'm innocent. From now on, I will go to the Gentiles." And he left there and went to the house of a man named Titius Justus, a worshiper of God. His house was next door to the synagogue. Crispus, the ruler of the synagogue, believed in the Lord, together with his entire household, and many of the Corinthians, hearing Paul, believed and were baptized. The Lord said to Paul one night in a vision, "Do not be afraid, but go on speaking, and do not be silent, for I am with you, and no one will attack you to harm you, for I have many in the city who are my people." And he stayed 1 year and 6 months, teaching the word of God among them. So there's great fruitfulness. Even though the Jews have turned against Paul and they refuse to hear about Christ in the synagogue ruler and many of them join with Paul and say, "Well, fine then, we're Christians now," and they make a house church next door to the synagogue. So he's staying there. Priscilla and Aquila are both introduced earlier in the chapter, and the word is just spreading around Corinth. So you've got this city, big city, a crossroads for the empire, and Paul, breaking with tradition, begins to build the church outside of the synagogue. He stays there 18 months working. But it says in chapter 12, when Gallio was the proconsul of Achaia, so that's the region, the Jews made a united attack on Paul and brought him before the tribunal. So it goes before this bema, this judgment seat, where the proconsul will pronounce judgment about civil issues that might break Roman law. And they say, this is verse 13, saying, "This man is persuading people to worship God contrary to the law." Because remember, the Jewish religion had Roman permission. And if you had a new religion, you didn't have Roman permission, you were against Roman law. But when Paul was about to open his mouth, Gallio said to the Jews, "If it were a matter of wrongdoing or vicious crime, O Jews, I would have reason to accept your complaint. But since it's a matter of questions about words and names of your own law, see to it yourselves. I refuse to be a judge of these things." And he drove them from the tribunal, so he won't even hear what's going on. So it says here, and they all seized Sosthenes, the ruler of the synagogue, and beat him in front of the tribunal, but Gallio paid no attention to any of this. We've heard of Gallio from history. We know who he is. We know the years that he was there, so we know a good case for when Paul was here. And the fact that they beat Sosthenes, now we don't quite know who Sosthenes was. He might have been the ruler of the Jewish synagogue, and Greek people might have gotten mad at the Jews for wasting their time with this stuff, and they might have beat him. Or this might actually be the Jewish people beating the leader of their own synagogue, saying, you didn't make a good case for us, and now we can't do anything for Paul. Or Sosthenes might have become a Christian recently, and they might have just beat him because they were mad that he turned against them. We don't quite know why they did this, but what this shows is that, look, Paul was protected. Even the leader of the synagogue got a beating, but Paul was protected. This proconsul refuses to hear any type of complaint against Paul. And so, once again, Paul is delivered. The gospel marches forward. And it says after this that Paul returns to Antioch and sets sail for Syria. He takes a vow and cuts his hair. And then he goes to Ephesus and visits some people there. And what we're going to talk about in the next lesson is Paul's time in Ephesus and his trip back to Judea. Ephesus has some very interesting stories, and like the one about Athens, I want to take a lot of time with it because there are really good details. And so next week we'll end the second missionary journey, and we'll talk about the conclusion of it. But this week, I want you to think about a couple of things. Number one, look at how in Corinth Paul changed his methods. He realized that the synagogue was not working out, and we're going to see that really the church at this point, it's organized differently. And the other thing I want you to think about is, how did Paul preach to the godless Athenians at Mars Hill different than he preached to the synagogue Jews and God-fearers in synagogues? So think about those. Leave a comment or email me back if you want to talk about how or discuss it more. I hope you're all doing well and have a good Lord's Day. God bless.